Okay, hello, this is Mr. Hotchkiss again. I'm reading part two of Farm Workers at Risk, the Growing Dangers of Pesticide and Heat. Just a real quick recap is we've talked about some of the problems with climate change and the use of pesticides and how that affects the farm workers physically and puts them at a higher risk of injury or death. Okay. We also talked about two states. They're doing three states. We're going to pick up on page 11 where they start talking about Florida, but we did talk about California, which is the number one producer and user of pesticides and also has some of the highest heat index days, which are the most unsafe times for workers. I believe the average was about 102 days per year. And Washington, which has about 40 some days per year of dangerous heat days. And both California and Washington are the top two users of pesticides. So it is pretty dangerous. All right, so I'm going to zip on down to page 11. Here we are on 5, 7, 9, 10. Here's 11. Okay, 11. This is a picture again. You'll be able to see this because I'll have that on there for you. Let me see what that does. Ooh, I like that. Interesting. All right. So we're going to start reading right here when we talk about Florida. Okay. Let me get that out of the way. Okay. Florida ranks third in the nation for total sales of fruits, tree nuts, and vegetables, behind California and Washington, and is the first in the nation in production of oranges. We'll go down to here. The 2017 census of agriculture estimated that Florida's farm worker population is 94,247, but a recent state-level analysis of labor and employment data for Florida produced a much higher estimate of 110,000 workers. Florida's dependence on agricultural pesticide puts the state farm workers at risk. Despite nearly 20 years of gradual decline in Florida's average pesticide application rates, the rates remain the highest in the nation, at almost 7 times the national average. Wow, I didn't know that. I kind of said that earlier that I think California was number one, but it turns out that Florida is the highest. The other two states were 4.5 times the national average, where this is 7 times the national average. Okay, so I'm right here now. Further, every one of the 10 most common pesticides applied to fruit, orchard crops, and vegetables in Florida have dire implications for farm worker health, more than either California or Washington. PAN, which you recall is the Pesticide Action Network, associates 6 with long-term health effects and 3 with acute toxicity, and the APA's lists 8 as causing injury or death through contact with the skin. Dangerous levels of Dangerous levels of heat compound the risk of pesticides for Florida farm workers. Historically, these workers have experienced an average of 193 days between April and October with a heat index over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Further, current heat conditions already pose a serious threat to Florida's population. From 2001 to 2010, Florida had the greatest increase of hospitalization for heat illnesses out of 20 states in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's National Environmental Public Health Tracking Program. Farm workers are no exception, with 84% of those surveyed in 2015 to 2016 reporting at least one symptom of heat illness and 40% reporting 3 or more symptoms. In this state, where so much of the April through October interval climate is already over the heat index, our threshold does not reveal the full story of increasing health risk because both the frequency and the severity of heat risk conditions are expected to rise. As in the cases of California and Washington, farm workers in Florida's top agricultural counties face relatively greater threats than those in other areas across the state. In these counties, the pesticide application rate reaches an average of 15.4 kilograms per acre, and farm workers have historically faced 202 days with a heat index above 80 degrees Fahrenheit from April to October. That's almost the entire time from April to October. That's crazy. Protections for farm workers are uneven and inadequate. While some progress has been made since the 1930s, farm workers continue to suffer from inconsistent and insufficient worker protection standards. Federal pesticide regulation is the responsibility of the EPA. Currently, the agency assumes that workers handling pesticides will be trained, equipped, and able to follow the full specified safety requirements. Evidence suggests that, on the contrary, farm workers have often received no training in pesticide handling and may not even know the names of the chemicals which they are working. As noted earlier, employers frequently fail to provide the full set of specified protective gear. While the EPA has made strides in restricting the use of some of the most toxic pesticides, the agency's overall approach fails to consider the potential for heat stress associated with protective gear. Farm workers who are not fully aware of the risks associated with pesticides in use may choose not to wear protective equipment to avoid the increased risk of heat illness. Even farm workers who are fully aware of the risks are put in the dangerous position of having to choose between risking harm from the pesticides or heat. There is no federal standard that specifically protects workers from dangerous heat. Although OSHA provides suggested guidelines for heat safety, the only legal requirement is OSHA's General Duty Clause, which obligates employers to provide workplaces that do not expose workers to recognized hazards that could cause death or serious physical harm. The lack of any specific heat standards makes enforcement of the General Duty Clause very difficult. State-level regulations for outdoor workers exist only in California and Washington. California is the only state with a comprehensive heat illness protection program for outdoor workers. California adopted the country's first heat protection standards on an emergency basis in 2005 and permanently in 2006. It requires employers to provide water and shade and, as the temperature rises, to enforce a work-rest schedule that dictates mandatory breaks. It also requires training for supervisors and employees on prevention, recognition, and treatment of heat illnesses. Washington followed California in adopting heat illness prevention regulations on an emergency basis in 2006 and 2007. Washington then adopted permanent regulations in 2008, which require employers to provide drinking water but do not specify the provision of shade. They do, however, require that employers supply the means to cool off or have written plans for preventing and dealing with symptoms of heat stress. Unlike those for California, Washington's regulations apply only from May to September, and then only when the temperature exceeds one of several thresholds: 89 degrees regardless of clothing, 77 if workers are wearing double-layer clothing, typical farm work attire, and 52 degrees if workers are wearing non-breathable coveralls. That's a good change. Farm workers rallied for justices in Bellingham, Washington in 2018. Fear of deportation. This is a key one right here. Fear of deportation marginalizes migrant farm workers and makes them feel less likely to report dangerous working conditions. All right, so let's go back up here and read the sentence again. Unlike those for California, Washington's regulations apply only from May to September, and then only when the temperature exceeds one of several thresholds: 89 degrees regardless of clothing, 77 if workers are wearing double-layer clothing, typical farm work attire, and 52 if workers are wearing non-breathable coveralls, such as those worn to protect against particularly toxic pesticides. California and Washington may be the two states doing the most to protect farm workers. In addition to protecting against heat, they are also two of the states with the most stringent regulation of pesticides. Both states have maintained public health programs that have monitored pesticide injury since the early 1970s, and both states have processes to report pesticide injury through state workers' compensation systems. Unfortunately, numerous barriers, including fear of firing or deportation, lack of access to health care, language barriers, and lack of familiarity with pesticide injuries among clinicians continue to limit adequate reporting of pesticide illnesses among farm workers. Policy recommendations. So here is where we're going to take a look at some of those policy recommendations. Okay. And this is going to be very similar maybe to another article that you have to read. When you go back into here, there's another one called Exposed and Ignored. And you can listen to that one also when we get to it. Okay, so here are the policy recommendations. My mouse disappeared, my fireworks. There they are. Okay. Policy recommendations. Over the long term, addressing the threats to farm workers posed by climate change requires rapid action to reduce heat trapping emissions. However, given that farm workers are already subject to injury and death from pesticide exposure and heat stress conditions, and that these threats are likely to increase even with rapid and aggressive emission reductions, additional measures are needed to protect farm workers now. Additionally, farm worker communities are already especially vulnerable to climate impacts, so it is critical that measures to address climate change do not come at the further expense of farm worker well-being. The science and practice of agroecology encompasses a diverse set of strategies for addressing medium and long-term objectives at the same time, with the potential to reduce reliance on pesticides, build climate resilience through soil health and diversification, reduce heat-trapping emissions, and sequester carbon in the soil. All right, let's make sure that I don't have anything underneath there. Okay, up here. To directly and rapidly protect farm workers who face unsafe and deteriorating working conditions, the United Union of Concerned Scientists recommends the following. Point number 1. Congress should direct OSHA to set and enforce standards that protect farm workers from heat-related injuries. Safety protocols for these workers should be consistently implemented when the heat index reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit to protect against 99% of injuries and 100% of deaths. Further, farm workers should be guaranteed the right to sufficient rest, shade, and water, the need for which will increase as extreme heat becomes more common. These rules should apply to all farms, including those with fewer than 11 employees. Point number 2. Congress should end the exclusion of farm workers from legal protections afforded to other workers, including minimum wage, overtime pay, the right to organize, and robust child labor standards. Protections such as the Fair Labor Standards Act and the National Labor Relations Act should be extended to include farm workers. In addition, as mandated rest breaks grow more frequent with increasing extreme heat, as per the aforementioned worker heat protection standards, Congress must protect farm workers' right to be paid for all hours worked. All right, point number 3. The EPA must make rigorous and timely assessments of risk when considering whether to allow, ban, or restrict the use of pesticides. Given the evidence of noncompliance with existing safety standards, the EPA should assess risk-based that's a mouthful. We'll start right there. Given the evidence of noncompliance with existing safety standards, the EPA should assess risk based on realistic rather than idealized use scenarios. Furthermore, use scenarios and risk assessments should account for the amplified risk of heat stress associated with the use of personal protective equipment. All right, so that seems like a lot there. So let's just kind of like unpack that. What they're saying is that there's evidence right now that no matter what they have in place, it's not being followed. That's non-compliance. Okay, so that's like they've got rules in place, but they're not following those rules, or farmers are not following those rules. So what they're saying is that they should be assessing risk based on realistic rather than idealized use scenarios. So basically, there should be some real things out there that are realistic that they can do. Yeah, and that's like risk would be considering whether to allow, ban, or restrict the use of pesticides. And that should be based on like this, where heat stress is really important because they say that increased risk comes with increased temperature to exposure to pesticides. All right, here's the next point. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, should fund and develop programs that protect farm workers by ensuring that all vulnerable communities have equitable access to disaster preparedness and disaster relief in the wake of extreme weather events, including extreme heat. Examples include the USDA's Disaster Assistance Program. So the USDA's disaster assistance program helps farmers, but it doesn't necessarily help farm workers. So like, let's say a tornado comes down and destroys a field. Well, that disaster assistance program will pay for that farmer's field because it destroyed the field. But right now it doesn't protect farm workers who might have been working in that field, or who lose their jobs because of that, or who are exposed to pesticides, or having heat stroke because they're in front of out working in hot weather. All right, so the next one is the USDA should work with other federal agencies to develop and improve a warning system that alerts farmers and farm workers of current and forecasted dangerous conditions. This effort may involve close coordination with numerous federal agencies, especially the National Weather Service. Research investments would be needed to improve this system over time and to enable more effective and targeted interventions. They've already got stuff in place. If you're out in a baseball field and a storm comes along, they've got sirens that go off. They've got heat index warnings that they put out all the time. They've got things that make your phone go off if there's a missing child somewhere. So if there's going to be a heat index warning, that's something that could be easily sent out through the system that's already in place. So that's just me. All right, I'm right here. To improve working conditions and decrease risks for farmers, farm workers, and society at large in the long term, the following actions should be taken. Congress and the USDA should identify ways to help farmers develop, implement, and share knowledge about farming systems that reduce reliance on and exposure to pesticides, ameliorate extreme heat. Ameliorate means to reduce extreme heat. And then we'll jump up here. And help with climate change mitigation and adaptation, basically to end or lower the problems with climate change and or adapting to it. All right. This effort should include increasing the availability of technical assistance through university-based cooperative extension services, including county extension offices, and ensuring that the USDA is actively providing growers with all relevant information on federal farm programs that support such practices. Resources should be targeted to prioritize improving conditions for the most farm workers while supporting young, beginning, socially disadvantaged, and other limited resource farmers whenever possible. All right, next point. Congress and the USDA should increase investments in public agricultural and agroecological research programs, particularly those that reduce exposure to extreme heat, heat-trapping emissions, and reliance on pesticides. For example, participatory research and farmer-to-farmer learning could be facilitated to identify farming systems that are more resilient to pests, have safer planting and harvest seasons or conditions, incorporate more shade through agroforestry, and contribute to climate change mitigation through reduced emissions or increased carbon sequestration. When we talk about carbon sequestration, what we're saying is we're saying store the carbon in the soil, somehow bring it back into the soil. For example, if I plant a tree, that tree starts to take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it inside the tree itself. And so that is carbon sequestration. So they plant trees, and that helps with climate change. Not a very long-term effective way to deal with it, but it is something that can start working. Okay, right here. Public research programs, including the USDA's Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education Program, and Organic Agriculture Research and Extension Initiative, need to be continually improved and expanded to address evolving challenges. Social science research is also needed to center farmers in learning how improved practices can be effectively adopted and scaled up to benefit farmers, rural communities, and especially farm workers. All right, federal and state policymakers should take aggressive actions to fight climate change and prevent drastic increases in dangerous heat conditions. This is something they've been asking for years. I don't know if it'll ever happen. So these include implementing and strengthening the Paris Agreement and achieving deep cuts to U.S. heat trapping emissions while protecting and increasing the levels of carbon stored in plants and soils. Such policies must be designed and implemented to explicitly consider and center the most vulnerable groups, which in this case is going to be the farm workers. All right, so the conclusion. More than 2.4 million farm workers in the United States make fundamental contributions to our health, social well being, and the economy by producing the food we eat every day, and they deserve to work in safety and dignity. However, the systemic exploitation of farm workers and their exclusion from legal protections leaves them especially vulnerable to hazardous workplace conditions. Our analysis reveals how farm workers' health and safety are already at risk. In a rapidly warming world, climate change threatens to amplify the harms farm workers already face from exposure to pesticides and heat related injury. Threats to farm workers are a threat to the nation, to our economy, food security, health, and rural communities. Farm workers deserve the respect, rights, and safeguards available to other workers, and recognition of their essential role in building a more resilient food and agricultural system. And that's the end. So there are a ton of different sources here. And this is an amazing paper with all these sources. Pretty cool. And I'm just going to kind of zoom down to the bottom. Okay, so just want to give you a background about the Union of Concerned Scientists. The Union of Concerned Scientists puts rigorous independent science to work to solve our planet's most pressing problems. Joining with citizens across the country, we combine technical analysis and effective advocacy to create innovative, practical solutions for a healthy, safe, and sustainable future. So they're a group of scientists that are really interested in creating a better world for everyone. And in this case, definitely creating a better world for farm workers, who are some of the most vulnerable people in the world. All right. Well, thanks for listening to this, and we'll probably be doing some stuff with this article. But this article was Farm Workers at Risk, the Growing Dangers of Pesticides and Heat. See ya.